This is RCCI, the Rural Community College Initiative. Teams from 24 communities in 12 states working to raise education levels and expand economic opportunities in distressed rural areas. The reason is simple: rural America matters. The RCCI is an initiative of the Ford Foundation. It is managed by MDC, a nonprofit corporation, with assistance from experts throughout the country. In June 2000, RCCI coordinators and the presidents and team leaders of the 24 colleges met with MDC staff and Ford program officers in Fort Yates, North Dakota, on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, home of Sitting Bull Community College. Following are the presentations of MDC President David Dodson and Community Development Consultant Richard Anderson, as they explore new ways of thinking about the leadership role of community colleges in fostering economic development.
From the start of the RCCI, and that's now been almost 6 years, we've aspired in this initiative to demonstrate how rural community colleges can help rural places strengthen economic development outcomes. That may mean strengthening rural companies and firms, fostering entrepreneurship, the development of new businesses, training competitive workers, importing new development strategies for our communities, things that hadn't been tried before, all toward the end of creating larger numbers of higher quality jobs. That was the vision or the picture when we sat out in the RCCI that we wanted to achieve around economic development. How do we have better employment and economic asset generation activities and strategies in parts of rural America that have been persistently poor? We all know that our rural communities need stronger economies. We also know that rural community colleges, because of the work that you often do to train workers for local businesses, already have strong connections in many cases with the private sector that contribute to economic activity. But the Rural Community College Initiative had a vision of something more than just workforce training programs, for instance, as an engine of economic development. We hoped when we started this initiative, and this was the Ford Foundation and MDC, that rural community colleges could begin to provide leadership in the area of rural economic development, both by providing imaginative training and support programs, kind of the traditional things colleges do, for economic development, but also by advocating a new definition of economic development that put an emphasis on three things: economic growth, that is, expansion of opportunity; economic sustainability, that meant doing development in such a way that we didn't deplete the natural and cultural and physical resources of rural areas, but helped renew them; and economic opportunity for people left behind. Our picture was that rural community colleges could advocate a kind of economic development that left people who had been left behind better off when the day was done. We had more examples than we would have liked to have seen of economic development strategies that might have benefited a few but left the many still far behind. And our picture, our vision, our hope for the RCCI was that somehow we could begin to advocate and move toward models of development that had better outcomes for more people, particularly people who had been poor and in poor economic circumstances for all of their lives. Well, that was the vision. But what exactly does it mean to go beyond simple economic development projects, which is sort of our traditional way of thinking what we do, to providing leadership in economic development, reorienting the way our regions think about and do the work of economic development so that more equitable outcomes arrive? What does the work of providing that kind of leadership in economic development look like? What strategies do you employ? What partners do you need? What kind of outcomes should you reasonably look for in a short period of time? For the past few years, what you have been doing, with some support from us, with resources from the Ford Foundation, but what you have been doing is to begin to feel your way toward answers to those questions. And I might say, and I think it's fair to say, and I think you know now, if you didn't know when you began this initiative, that we don't have many models of this kind of economic development leadership and these kind of economic development strategies that produce sustainable, equitable economic outcomes for poor regions. If we did, we would have just said, here are the models, Ann McNutt is smiling. Go do these 5 things. It would have been a lot easier for you, wouldn't it, I think, than trying to figure out just how do we do this. The work, the journey we set out on in many ways was, it's a term I like to use, was countercultural. It may fly in the face of the predominant culture of economic development activity that is present in our rural areas. We asked in the RCCI for you to explore the possibilities of a different vision of rural development that would make rural people and rural communities that were traditionally poor better off. And we gave you some clues, but really we asked you to experiment in finding ways to bring about those outcomes. Well, Richard Anderson is here this morning to help us think deeper and harder about how rural community colleges can play a leadership role to help usher in this new vision of economic development that is about sustainability, equity, and deeper outcomes for poor people and poor communities. He's going to present some ideas that MDC has found very helpful, very challenging, to show us how a college can add value to the economic development activities that might already be in place in some rural areas, or help transform the way our rural communities think and go about economic development if our current strategies aren't producing the outcomes that we want. And our hope this morning for this workshop is that his remarks will stimulate you to think, perhaps think differently, will inspire your creativity, will confirm for you some of the things that you may be doing that you find successful and are bearing fruit, and help us do what the RCCI is in large measure about: learn how to do untested things a little smarter and a little better. So with that, I want to invite Richard up and welcome him, thank him for being here. He is in great demand all over the place, and we're lucky that he elects to choose to spend time with us, but I think that may be because he likes us, and it may be because he sees, I hope it is, some potential in what we are doing that he can help us further and fulfill. So Richard, welcome, thank you, and we are all yours.
Thanks, David. David just gave a really nice history about the vision of this program and the experimentation that each of you are undertaking in your regions all around us, and this vision has attracted national investment, which is expecting a return on their investment, as well as, I think, your communities are hoping for that kind of return. And succinctly, it seems like this is the organizing statement for RCCI, which is organized on the idea that community colleges can impact low-income communities by expanding educational opportunities and improving economic conditions. Someone decided that in rural places, community colleges were the place for that, sort of the institution of choice or the leverage point that made the most sense to cause those kinds of changes. There is 6 years of experience in this room. As quickly as we can, I would like to sort of develop our menu of the projects that you've done to date. Just the bumper sticker. What are the projects, both in economic projects and in educational access? And Ken and David are going to write as furiously as we can. And let's get those projects up, because then we're going to talk about the relationship between those projects and this statement. Okay? So let's start off.
Campbell opened 4 neighborhood educational centers in the communities.
College is a low-country partnership with a very difficult school situation for a Gear Up grant, and it was successful, and it's making a tremendous difference.
Had 2 main initiatives. One was to create a network, telecommunications network, amongst 22 school districts in the college, where we are now delivering over 40 courses a semester through that for educational access. And at the same time, we started a business and industry or workforce training initiative, which has been extremely successful. Also uses the infrastructure, but does it in the more traditional way too, just getting to businesses and matching up needs with training.
We partnered with school districts, government entities, community leaders to address the Colonia initiatives. We have 50 colonias in Webb County. If our project is successful, we can use that as a model to address the multiplicity of needs of Colonia residents.
We're later going to talk about something that I think is quite important, and that is the stages of these projects, which I think there are 3 stages of rolling out these projects, and the skill and competence you have to have at each of the stage in rolling these out. So I want to have you sort of remember that as we'll come back to these projects at that point. When you look at the economic development projects, can anyone stand up and actually say they changed economic conditions in their region? You can? Sure, go ahead.
Well, at Southeastern Community College, Columbus County has been described as an economically depressed area, deprived area, because we've had all of our textile closings. We have had an opportunity to provide training for over 1,600 people in the last 1.5 to 2 years that have lost their jobs. They're turning to the community college. Even though we've had a lot of plant closures in our area, we still have been fortunate enough to have industry coming and investing money in our county. I work very closely with the French Wire Company that has invested $15 million in our county. They came to us in 1996, opened their plant in 98. We provided training, customized training, are in the process of expanding their workforce for them. They're looking at doubling their investment, and they will tell you today, the plant manager will give you the testimony that the reason why he chose to come to North Carolina and come to Columbus County because of the community college and the impact that we can provide when it comes to training opportunities for them. So the incentive package that our county provides for new and expanding.
I mean, really what you're talking about is being able to roll out, have a deep enough knowledge of the core business processes of a company to be able to actually create a training curriculum that actually adds value to their incoming workforce, which improves the economic performance of those companies and the faster startup. When that happens, more companies go, gee, I want to go to a community that can do that for me. That community seems to be working. And it sort of builds on itself. The thing that actually was not a linear relationship, you had companies streaming in from the outside for a variety of reasons. There was not a linear relationship between the school, companies saying, I want to come into this region, and then the training. Economic opportunity in your region happened because firms for a variety of reasons, came into your region. RCCI, and that happens. That's great. And in fact, actually, if you can get behind a flow and strengthen it, that's precisely where you should be. But the visionaries of RCCI actually thought that you could go one step further. The visionaries of RCCI said, we think that you as a community college can do things that cause the flow to happen. Has anyone done that? Has anyone caused the flow in their communities to happen?
I want to say I have not, but I must follow up Beverly's comments. First, she's exactly right. We're a neighbor to the south. And it wasn't through RCCI. That college was out there on the cutting edge earlier in economic development. And Beverly was very involved. And that college really has caused economic development big time.
Right.
My point is this. They've been at it a long, long
Right. Right.
And I think we will see some fruits of all these projects up here. But it's going to take a long, long time. Longer than what we have been at it so far.
The cycle time of an economic development project versus the cycle time of an educational access project are absolutely, totally different. Right? In other words, what it takes to actually organize an articulation agreement and actually do the training or step in with an industry and actually provide that, you can sort of get a feedback loop pretty quickly about how you're doing. Changing economic opportunity in your region is a longer cycle time. Chattanooga, the most polluted and racially divided city. I don't know if they were the most racially divided, but they were a racially divided, but the most polluted city in the country in 1969 is now a global, it's a global model for environmental and community sustainability 40 years later. All right? 40 years. Tupelo, Mississippi took the second poorest county in Mississippi, which means one of the poorest counties in the country, and turned it into one of the most productive, wealth-creating counties in Mississippi over a 40-year period. All right? So the cycle times are completely different.
Richard, define just for all of us lay people, when you mean cycle time, what precisely are you referring to?
Well,
conception to results, or?
Yeah, and I use a lot of private sector terminology because our work at Northern Initiatives, which I ran for a while, really had to adopt a language of industry, or they weren't going to pay attention to us. And guess what? Cycle time is a pretty darn important concept if you're producing a product. It's the standard language of making things. And you are making things. You people are tool makers. Your tools that you're making are these projects. And the cycle time from the massing the raw resources to actually designing the product to actually pumping it through your production system to getting it to the customer, and the cycle time of rejects coming back that were wrong, and then the payment from the customer and the quality rating. Those are the feedback loops that inform the improvement of your production process. And you have the same responsibility, and you do it all the time in these projects. The feedback loops to economic projects are longer. We will not know for a long time, especially when government subsidizes things. We do not know if they were commercially viable. We will not know if the aquaculture project is going to be a commercially viable thing until we hope that the subsidization of it actually launches it into a commercially viable project. We won't know that for a long time. We could count the jobs today in that, but it has nothing to do with reality. Right? Now, let me just tell you what I think you do have control over, because that's what you should concentrate on, That's what should be sustainable, and that's what you should be assessed on, right? Is what you control. You measure what you manage, and you can only manage what you control. You are trying to impact, RCCI schools are trying to impact an economic system over which community colleges have little leverage. And I think RCCI colleges are trying to impact educational access where community colleges have more influence.
I'd just like to make one statement there. I know you're saying you feel like with economic development that community college has very little opportunity, but I would like to say that in North Carolina or in our area, particularly in Columbus County, we've been able to be a major player in the economic development ring.
Right.
We've got all of our partners coming together and working cooperatively, and we're part of the economic development recruitment team. And over the last 10, 15 years, the college has had an opportunity to become a major player, to have major involvement in that, and then the educational access is a result of the economic development impact.
This is a very important point because I don't want to be misunderstood here. Right? I don't want to be misunderstood because you're making a very important point. At some point, and I'll use Tupelo as the analogy, an economic development project of the stakeholders of Tupelo was to create a community college because they didn't have one. Now, when you measure the impact, that took years, and then it took years for them to become competent and be real players that were meaningful in the economy. And then they became what you just described. They became so influential in the conduct of improving enterprise performance that they were then influencing and becoming a major leverage point down the road. It can happen. It does happen. But it is somewhere in the middle of that mix. It's not at the beginning of the mix, right? There are other things, there are other factors that come together that when a community college enters and has meaningful relationships with people in the environment, it actually accelerates the opportunity. And I think that's so that's key. That's a key qualifier. So the enabling environment, as I've looked at the RCCI project, the enabling environment sets the stage for community and economic development and educational access projects. We used some of the examples and said, oh, you mean that idea reached into the community interest educational system. That idea reached into the governmental system. That idea went into the economic system. These are the players in your economy, and we all have them, whether you're an Indian reservation or you are, sitting with a bunch of paper companies or you're in a mining region. You each have one of these. Some are more dominant than others. Some obscure others. But this enabling environment sets the stage for economic development improvement and educational access. And it seems like community colleges are the multi-stakeholder institutions that reach into most parts of these enabling environments. They do it through your advisory boards, your board of directors, through the founders who created your school, through the industry advisory groups that you have, to the students that you graduate who become employees of the region or who go on to college. That is your asset that you act on. You have no other asset. You are not competent at running commercial systems. All right? If you did, you probably would have picked other avenues to pursue your career in. Zifrido.
I wanted to give you an example of something. Our college is located 20 miles from the Los Alamos National Lab. The Los Alamos National Laboratories have a budget of about $1 billion a year $1 billion. And it's only about 20 miles away. And yet, this little college down the hill, that's us, has been in existence now, it'll be 25 years, a year and a half. And the former owner of the foreign dealership in house made a statement to the newspaper about 2 years ago. And he said, next to the LaSalle International Lab, he said, the community college is the best thing ever happened here. And I thought, oh gosh, that's a statement. But what he was talking about, I think, is that access has created the foundation for economic development.
Well, I think you're seeing a couple things, and this also works for Carlsbad. It worked for our region. You can have major players, a single player. Ours was Sawyer Air Force Base, the fourth largest city in 16,000 square miles. You can have, those are assets. We depend on them. They become so dominant, they dominate our economic life. Many people think that in fact, maintaining that and building it is the obvious future. We sure did, until someone decided to close it, or the Forest Service tries to burn it down in your region, right? And then all of a sudden things change. In an economy, a weakness is a strength that went too far. A weakness is a strength that went too far. And what I think somebody is saying to you is that your college is creating a sort of a multiple lens in the community. It sees other opportunities. It certainly enables people to get ready for the jobs at the lab, and it should. But it also, because it has connections to other parts of the system, where they're seeing poverty, where they're seeing people without literacy skills, where they're seeing the lack of other kinds of economic choices, it's an institution that actually can act on that. The lab cannot act on that. So I think it's important. Yes?
Richard, I'm also thinking in terms of the college being an advocate for those same people that you're talking about, because we invest in human potential, and that's a long-term investment.
Right.
And so what in our region, the people we're looking at that are from the colonias with the limited skills and all of those things are the people who are not reaping the benefits of NAFTA right now in our region.
Right.
But there's a possibility that they might if they're ready for it.
Right.
You know, but you still need to think
Right.
in the future, 20 years from now.
Right. Permanent institutions that can reflect on potential in communities is really what community colleges are. I think the investors in community development struggle about sustainable institutions. Yes?
Yeah, you know, what you're saying is what we discovered, I guess, about 9 months, 10 months ago in Carlsbad, in that the community college was probably the sole institution that had the ability to affect this kind of change. And so for economic development, we realized things had to be aligned. So we looked at the Chattanooga model and your model in Michigan, or whatever you want to call them, or experiences in Tupelo.
Right.
And so we've reached out in the community and formed a group. And right now we've got almost 600 volunteers. And we're moving toward consensus, and we've entered into a community consultation. And we've actually started a real fire in the community as far as talking about what are the problems as far as educational access, social systems, economic problems, all these kinds of things, identifying those problems, and what are the possible solutions to them. And it's really exciting what's going on, and we hope we can. All we're doing is facilitating it and acting as a conduit to move it out in there, because the college has got that political neutral umbrella.
Let me just.
We've got that ability to come in there and do that. We see no other group that's got that ability. We're buffered from a lot of that.
Look what you're doing. You're creating the conditions for alignment. That's what you're doing. that influences those stakeholders in that enabling environment. And I think another thing, when we benchmark these models, isn't it odd that, and I've looked all over the country, there really are only a couple models that help us understand alignment. There are plenty of economic development project models. There's a big difference. The two models that we seem to be gravitating toward that help us understand how you achieve alignment of people in your community about, I'm headed somewhere, and Ron, I want to stop right here and ask, what was Sitting Bull's effect on this nation?
I was listening to you talk earlier about the idea of first having to create a college. We're only 26 years old. The first thing you had to do was create the darn college, and then as you went on with your idea that you had established credibility, and maybe the K-12 institution never ever believed in us. And today we're to the point where we've created so many partnerships and partners with the tribe to expand that transportation system. Not only the tribe, with the state and federal government helped us in expanding that, also local vocational rotation program. We partner with the K-12 schools in terms of uplifting their just their attendance,
right,
plus their science and math programs, and bringing NASA in to help them.
So you're almost creating magnetic north.
Partnerships with our local community now want to partner up with us to build a gymnasium so that they got some place for the kids to go to after hours. Partnership with the casino in terms of educating their employees, not only educating their employees, retraining them, but also getting them here with the transportation system. We talked about alignment, and alignment means developing those partnerships so that you work on common problems and interests with each other. And we've touched almost every one of those. The only one which we're having a hard point in time at this point in time is the social system, and that's because as tribal people, we're really fearful of change in the social system because of the genocide that has been put through.
Right.
The genocidal efforts of the federal government in the last 20 years.
And there are certain parts of the governmental social system you don't control. And so thinking about changing the social system means thinking about changing things that aren't in your control. But really what Ron talked about was moving a nation that may have had people who were, and I've used this analogy before, in a variety of different directions, and it becomes a focal point. What Tupelo and Chattanooga took 40 years. It is absolutely amazing that Carlsbad is doing it in a year. There is setting the stage for creating alignment. Because in Tupelo, the cycle time between the visionary McLean and his notion that things had to improve, his variety of projects that led to people learning how to work together, that gave them the thought that maybe if we work together not just on these projects, but we work together on where we're taking this community, and if we're real clear about where we're taking this community, our individual actions in our daily lives in these parts of the enabling environment will be the right decisions that click. So in one sense, if I were actually looking at assessing a project about the impact, I wouldn't really be looking outward. I'd be looking at how has the investment in this strategy changed how communities see the potential for the alignment compared to benchmarks, which is Tupelo. Now, it doesn't mean that, I don't know if you skip the 20 years of Chattanooga and Tupelo, and Chattanooga was, it's an amazing, they're very different models, by the way, and if you don't know them, you should find out about them. But in Chattanooga, it was industry learning to collaborate on reduction of pollution that caused them to understand the greater power of corporate, civic, and business leaders working on the direction of Chattanooga. But they had to sort of work together on reducing pollution first. once they learned to do that, they accelerated the movement. What you are doing in creating alignment is attempting to collapse 20 years plus of learning experience, usually driven by a couple visionaries in the community, but not always. Sometimes encouraged by the enabling environment, like EPA's criticism of Chattanooga, which got a group of people to work on something. And you are now trying to come out the chute with a group of, with the enabling environment working as well as it did in our models. Now, we don't know anything about whether or not that's going to work. But that's essentially what's happened. And that's the process you control. The process you control is your innovation, and it is an RCCI innovation. It hasn't happened anywhere that I know of. Your innovation is creating alignment. Now, some of you have not done big summit meetings, but you've created alignment around, with certain constituencies around certain projects like educational access or industry training, which is really maybe the safer route, because it's the route that the other communities took, as long as it's guided by a vision of where you can take that. As long as it's guided by that, I think it's the safer route. We talked about the communities that have taken these big sort of summit. I'd say it's higher risk. Higher risk, higher return. Usually when you have a higher risk, you get a higher return, and you'll learn about that tonight. I want to talk a little about the enabling environment. We've talked, I think, enough about it, so we'll go through that quickly. I also think there's another thing influencing this. It's the stage of where you're at as an institution, and you're all at different stages of development. You cannot pull off as a community college certain things if you're struggling over fundamental things. You shouldn't be expected to. You should concentrate on the fundamental business. And guess what? Businesses are the same way. Companies are at various stages of their own development. And again, you can't place an expectation for them to be worrying about the community when they're trying to make a buck. And their bottom line's telling them they're losing money. They got other priorities. Now you combine those two systems, and you got a lot of variability. And so all of our strategies have to be conducted within the context of where are people at in your community. So I'm going to try to help you through that really quickly. There is an example of the enabling environment. Whenever I go into a community, I ask them to ship newspapers to me. And when I looked at the newspaper in northern New Mexico, it was very entertaining. It was one of the most entertaining papers. I mean, people have sent me papers, but that paper I read. I mean, I read lots of it. It was a scandal sheet. Absolute scandal sheet. And its view of the world was that if you were in public office, you were on the take. That paper, when I drove through town, it happened to be Wednesday when they were selling it, and it's the only rural community that I've ever seen, maybe it happens in southwestern states, where there were kids selling the paper on the streets, just like New York City. And people were scooping them up to read about the scandals. Interestingly enough, in Tupelo, it was a newspaper that used the newspaper as a platform to set expectations for the community. Guess what your paper's doing? It drives expectations down. It actually is an influencer of community interests. Zafrito, this paper is on its own developmental path. You have to deal with it. It is a factor in your community. It is a newspaper that actually takes a guardian view of their role, which, by the way, the framers of our Constitution said that's precisely where they should be. All right? What George McLean did with his newspaper, and by the way, you know, Chattanooga didn't have this, we don't have this, lots of people don't have newspapers who feel this way. But George McLean felt that and when you walk into the newsroom in Tupelo, on the floor mat is the vision, and McLean decided not to put it on a wall because no one ever looks at the wall, but they all do wipe their feet. And on that mat says, essentially, is the vision, which is that the paper is The community, you know, so the shared destiny is community. The purpose of the paper is the development of the community of Tupelo. Well, that's very fortunate that he actually chose that mechanism because he didn't have a community college as a platform. So he picked some other. You can all pick different platforms. But I wanted to amplify community interests as part of the enabling environment. And what Zafrida tried to do is he tried to change the enabling environment. Personally, he walked right in the door and he said, I want you to see a different model. What he's actually up against is, I want you to develop into a higher consciousness of your opportunity here. That's what you're really saying. When you say to someone who's at one level that you should be at another level, and you see it but they don't, guess who's in control? They're in control. And you're dealing with that throughout your, when you assemble, if Carlsbad gets 2,000 people, you're dealing with 2,000 people who are at various stages of their own development. And so is your college, right? I don't know if this is true, but I'm going to put it up there as a proposition. I have a theory about the development stages of a community college. And for those, this all sort of comes out of chaos theory and stuff I won't get into. But anyway, this theory is that all systems have instability. And it's the instability that causes someone to actually move up to the next step or to fall behind. But it's the instability that we learn about. I'd like to propose, and this has nothing to do with the RCCI phases or the terminology. This is, you know, so don't, if they use the word phase or stage, that's nothing to do with RCCI terminology. The schools that are working to figure out how to create educational programs for particular constituencies, the instability is employers. If you don't have a pre-nursing program and the hospital administrator comes to you and says, we'd like a pre-nursing program and we think students would come to it, your instability is your relationship with the hospital and the medical industry to figure that out. That is your core business. And community colleges, there are a lot of community colleges that absolutely stay in this phase, right? I mean, it's a hard enough challenge doing this because things change constantly. But if you are able to get competent at doing this, you systematize your innovation process to roll out programs, and John talked about moving from, and this was in workforce training, but moving from the paper industry to the timber industry, and you've accelerated that. If you begin to get competent systems at doing that, you get a brand new instability. And the instability is the local community. Because now you're having more and more conversations with people outside of the educational programs because they, in their institutions, in the paper companies, what are they dealing with? They're dealing with environmentalists. They're dealing with EPA. They're dealing with forest management practices. Well, suddenly you're a supplier to them. And you, by being a supplier to them here and doing a good job, you can't help but get connected to the wider community of concerns. That becomes your instability, and when you work on that and embrace the fact that you are really, you transcend your relationships with employers to embrace the entire community, then you have really what I think is the third phase, which is sort of the wider world, which I won't really get into, other than the fact that you're subjected to that in your core business when in fact it's not school to work, but it's school to higher education. And you're exposed to the wider world in that instability there, the articulation. John?
Richard, I think when you present something like this, it's very difficult to say, to explain the complexity of it, but if you're in phase 3, you're also in phase 1.
Yes, you embrace. Absolutely. You embrace, and then you transcend and embrace.
Right, and then transcend and embrace.
That's right. So, yes. And that is what...
Very similar to Maslow.
Yes. Yeah. Although that's a bit that's a bit, the feedback loop is motivated by lower level motivations. I think here,
But as you move towards self-actualization, you also have to be worried about making sure that you do have food.
right,
You know, so I mean,
right.
you can't quit thinking about the other.
All right, perfect example, because I'll tell you what, Levi Strauss had that problem in running their company. Let's talk about that, because companies have the same problem. Levi Strauss is a company that has, with visionaries that believe that they actually wanted to run a global corporation with a view around environmental sustainability, a relationship with workers, a relationship with communities, and their core business went to hell. And other competitors bypassed them. If you're not paying attention to your core phase one, it'll eventually trip you up when you're down there. Right? So, let's talk a little about the companies, because you know what? Most of our rural, why they picked you all is because most of your companies are in phase one, if you have any companies at all. Right? Companies in our regions in rural America are struggling for profitability. They're just struggling to make a buck. And when they're struggling to make a buck, they see one factor, and that's the customer. And a lot of companies, owners, stakeholders of companies, think there's sort of if they really stop and think of it, they have a shared destiny with their customer. And the more they integrate and respond to the needs of their customer, the better. They tend to forget about their employees. And when you forget about your employees, you have labor management problems. And most companies never get out of this stage. It is we versus them, the culture, the mining industry, right? We versus them. Very few companies are thinking about their employees. The instability is in the first phase, profit, and I think I'd add employees. I think the instability is employees. When you begin to embrace your employees, when there's a shared destiny between employees, your customers, and you as an owner of a company, you tend to start acting totally different. Ford Motor Company made a decision that they were going to give their 300,000 employees computers and internet access outside of the bargaining agreement, because they felt their company and the development of their employees and the families of those employees, that they had a shared destiny with that path that people were taking. That is a company that has moved beyond phase one, right? And if you have a phase two company in your community that's part of your economic system, when Zafrito sits down and talks to you, you're going to have a much different kind of conversation, aren't you? Than talking to someone who, when you leave, is calling the banker for gap financing to make payroll. All right? So we're all lucky if we have some phase two, where there's sort of a shared destiny between labor, making profits, your markets, your ownership. But the minute a company starts reaching to its employees and sees them as part of the system, it inevitably drags companies into the community. You're dealing with single-parent households. You're dealing with educational problems. You're dealing with crime. You're dealing with lack of educational access. You're dealing with a variety of things that families sort of understand as a unit, that when you have several of your employees or hundreds of your employees, as a person who, as a company owner who actually cares about their employees, you can't help but care about your community. But the instability is the community. What's the company going to do about it? That's the instability. That's the time period of of companies not knowing what to do, of testing out ideas. And then third, and we're not going to talk about this because in the world there are very few companies like this, but phase 3 companies who actually have a global view of shared destiny. If you want to read more about this, there's a great book by Joe Jaworski called Synchronicity, The Inner Path to Leadership. And although he doesn't lay it out quite this way, it's his personal journey around leadership. And he ended up, and I think he's back there now running Shell Oil's global scenario planning program, where Shell Oil went from the worst functioning big oil company in the world to being considered one of the best over a period of time, and he talks about that. But essentially, Shell Oil went from helping its country managers anticipate changes in the environment so that if Iraq did something, they'd know how to act. I mean, they'd go through a set of scenarios so that the company would know how to react to the next sort of set of circumstances. Shell Oil went from that to saying, why don't we actually just influence how it's all going to come out? Why should there be a conflict with Iraq? Why don't we get together with other global corporations and have a conversation about it and bring in the secretaries of states? There are a few corporations that believe that the stability of the world is important to their self-interest. Now, that's very few companies. That just gives you an idea. The only reason I went through that example is that if you have a company that thinks like Shell Oil does worldwide, but in your own community, you got yourself one heck of a partner. You have a leader in your community. So let's just stop there and see, how does this sit with you? Is this, any questions?
Both of these models, if I could say, apply to your individual development as a person. As John was speaking to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that even yourself, as you amass the things that sustain you as an individual, as you become a more stable individual, if you give all of your proceeds of your life away, then you are back down to level 1. And always remembering...
Well, you may be happy.
But you may be happy, but you are...
Right.
What was the point of passing it?
Right.
That you've watered down your cause.
Right.
Or your goal.
Right.
And that's the same with the community college, of course, stating the obvious here, that if you ever forget why you really existed or what your goal was, if you are not always reaching back to that as you go forward,
right.
We're one of the few institutions that has to look back and go forward at the same time.
Right, right.
Then you can definitely
transcend and include. You have to transcend and include. John?
Richard, and just one other thought is that there are very few people that are businesses or community colleges or whatever that are only in phase 1.
Right.
They may be predominantly in phase 1.
Right.
But there are
aspects of them are, so it's, so what John's bringing about is, and that's just an additional level of complexity. I'm going to start adding complexity to this, because now we're really talking about RCCI is investing in a very complex circumstance. It is not linear. We give MDC money, MDC gives colleges money, colleges improve the economy. Not linear, all right? It is very complex. The level of change is dependent upon the level of development of the players, and John just introduced, by the way, inside a player, it's variable. Right?
And I think it is the layering that the opportunity exists. It is when it is that piece of a company or a college or a community that is in the next phase.
Right.
That is the leverage point for pulling them further into the next phase.
Right. So if you're scanning as the CEO for where the instability is in part of your system that's in phase 1, that's the opportunity to actually bring the whole platform up. That's what you're saying. And this graphic is essentially tries to combine these and then keep John's thought in mind, is that essentially you've got the economic system, government, social systems, educational systems, your community interests as sort of the enabling environment that you've all attempted to reach into. And I've happened to choose businesses as one of the systems, but you could also say governmental agencies, but let's use businesses. You could have stage one, you could have a community college, a stage one community college, having a set of relationships with stage one businesses, which is pretty normal. It's possible that you could have a stage two community college dealing with stage three, although it's probably less likely. Let's do this. Stage one community college that's attempting to relate to stage two businesses when they haven't actually been able to be competent at delivering services to businesses. And here, they're trying to deal with the community, with the businesses. Well, guess what? That breeds cynicism. They'll come to your meeting, but they actually don't believe you're going to pull it off. And there's probably a reason for cynicism. The reason for cynicism is that stakeholders in your community don't believe you have actually managed your core business to actually have this conversation. It may be true, it may be not. It may be a perception problem. You got to work on it.
And can't be defensive about it.
And can't be defensive about it. If you're defensive, that cuts off communications. So my point here is you throw in an economic summit to create alignment, or you throw in a set of workforce articulation projects or any one of this list, you got to throw it in within the context of where you're at. This is probably more important for looking at the implications of the national RCCI project in general. In other words, what are our expectations of doing this? It has to be judged within the context of where the players are at, because you can't jump these stages. You absolutely can't jump these stages. I talked about the competence of your programs. It's now, I'm going to go through these very quickly and then we'll see what we want to do. I think there's 3 stages of competence. We said you can't jump these stages unless you're good at rolling this stuff out, and you better be good at your rolling out your level 1 work with businesses, your training programs. And here's how you do it. Here's how you're all doing it. You start with high-quality individual transactions. You have products and services that your customers value. You have the necessary competence. You have capable and stable systems for producing your product. They become self-sustaining over time. You're designing them through either tuition or through funding or through fee-for-services. And you pick your customers strategically. Don't get into the physical therapy business like the college that I'm a trustee on. If there are only 12 placements in the entire region and it takes 30 to break even, which is what we were dealing with at our board meeting. Huh? Well, why didn't we really be more strategic about this? Why are we losing $180,000 every year we run the physical therapy program? Right? Same thing. Phase 2, a network of relationships come as a result of stage 1. It helps you build a network of long-term relationships, of mutual trust and respect with key players in the system you're trying to influence. Your transactions have already been of high enough quality to earn you respect in the market. You don't compete with people that you're trying to collaborate with. You have deep enough knowledge of the sector to know who the important players are. That's key. Your commitment to change is long-term enough to wait for relationships to evolve. No amount of funding and positioning and project execution is going to make up for the natural path of relationships that take place and grow over time, that allow you to do things you couldn't do in the beginning, that you now can do. That's why RCCI is worried about sustainability. That's why they should be worried. And if they're actually worried about it, then they actually care about the quality of your relationships. They're not going to really care about your project executions. I mean, that's the stuff you should manage. You should be managing your day-to-day feedback on, did we do enough loans, or did we actually execute enough people? Did we get enough people at our conferences? Those are your measures. Their measures are the the quality of the relationships, which really allow you to go into build your network of relationships. Are you competent at relationship building? You know, as competent as service delivery. That's key. Are you as competent in relationship building as you are in service delivery? Which gets into the third stage, which I put at the very bottom, or let's start at the top. The top is now you can start combining novel combinations of assets in your communities, which you could never have done before. And those combinations allow you to actually pull off big systems changes. And there are a variety of things you got to be good at there, including the last one, which is big. You just sort of be lucky enough to be there at the right time. Which timing and luck, you know, if it's not resonating, it's not time, right?
Just a comment about the concern that you had about the phase one institution working with the phase two business. And sometimes you have to start someplace. And if you understand what you've just presented here, you can actually act as an institution in any one of these three areas to be able to move yourself creatively to the next level. And what I mean by that, we had something called Industrial Foundation Training Consortium, where in fact the two colleges involved, community and technical college, didn't have the expertise necessary that were required to demonstrate their capability of delivering to the phase two companies.
Right.
But they had enough knowledge of the capabilities of the phase two companies to bring them together and engage them in a conversation as to how they could benefit from working from each other. And so where expertise was needed in one area, rather than taking it from the college, they actually got it from the other phase two companies. And so the facilitation
right.
of that was the responsibility
Right.
of the college, and so you look like
Right.
you're doing it now.
Let me tell you something. No. You just unlocked a key that took the Ford Foundation $20 million to find out. We just been working on how do corporations learn. I've been part of an assessment of a $20 million portfolio of how corporations actually learn and then how do they embrace community. And one of the places where it happens the fastest is when the nonprofit intermediary hosts corporations, facilitates peer-to-peer learning. That companies want to learn from one another. It isn't so much you telling a company how to improve their deal. It's clustering companies to have a conversation, and when they cluster, they come back and tell you what they need. It's like what you're doing. This is how learning occurs. It's the transfer of learning. And when your economic development projects are one-on-one, trying to you add value to their commercial system, it's not going to be as well executed, it's not going to be as effective unless you've actually internalized the core business processes of that company yourself enough to teach it. And a way to get around that is to actually bring them together to actually talk about it and have a competence around facilitation.
Richard, I have a question.
Sure.
It's not a question to answer here, but one of the things that this presentation has helped me see is that the RCCI has provided funds and support to encourage and entice colleges to venture out toward phases 2 and 3. I mean, I think along that broader continuum.
Right.
The question I have is that if we think about convention, this is sort of a policy issue, where society puts its resources for community colleges based on what assumptions about the work of community colleges are community colleges funded. It seems that a lot of the funding is phase one. It assumes colleges belong in phase one, that the relationships will be phase one rather than phase two or phase three relationships. The importance of leveraging public policy change and leveraging those relationships is so we can begin to get those constituents to help us advocate for different attitudes about what community colleges can do. And the only way we're going to do that convincingly is to have a track record that shows we can, in fact, be effective at phases 2 and 3. But I'm struck by this conversation that what the RCCI is doing is trying to demonstrate whether colleges can be effective at phases 2 and 3. But there needs to be a pipeline of resource support if colleges are going to be able to continue to work there. Otherwise, this is a noble experiment. But can the experiment be sustained if public expectations about the role of community colleges are confined, expectations as defined by the way colleges are funded are confined to phase 1? And I hadn't seen that tension quite in that way until we saw these phases. And I think public policy, by and large, is not attuned with the potential of what these, what our colleges
Now that just
do
generated a
value
whole.
To,
Right.
I didn't mean to open Pandora's box.
No. Right, this is critical. So let's just go pepper through the room on this issue. This is just, do you want to start here and then just move down?
I can just quickly say that, and I've kind of done a historical thing that I'll share later, but the role of the community college changes, expands. When it started as a junior college in 1910 to 48, it was university preparation. Then we got into community colleges and access became important. Also workforce development and so on. And if you want to characterize the current era 1990 or so, RCCI is into economic development, community development, and so on. And each time the box gets larger. But it's like a pyramid that base has to remain, and you have to be competent at that base. And you bring the stakeholders and the community folks and the legislature along, but you could never give up that primary first function, it seems.
Right. John?
Just to amplify what Drew's saying, North and South Carolina, and particularly North Carolina, North and South, because I'm putting you as the second tier in that group, took a very different approach to how they defined what community colleges would be in the beginning.
Precisely, right.
And they said that these are economic development engines. So the focus in those two states has really been, in regard to what you're describing, Richard, far dramatically ahead of all of the other states that I'm familiar with.
When I went to Europe, I went to visit the core of where you changed or had leverage over economic opportunity were the chambers of commerce. And I go, in our country, man, chambers of commerce are the last place, right? Because chambers have totally different expectations. How did your chambers actually sort of become recognized as sort of engines of economic change or competitiveness change within industry? They said, well, Napoleon decided that he was going to create a organization that combined education with industry, and he called those chambers of commerce. All right? So you're at a very, in our, I think your point is that this is a national discussion, but this is a state discussion, isn't it? Maybe even more than a national discussion, although there could be a national dialogue on it. Who better to actually organize a national dialogue than you guys, right? Or your trade association, yeah.
Michael said he was wondering just to what degree community colleges could become level 2 and later level 3. When I described what I just described, it was from an experience from another part of the state of Kentucky, where I'm convinced that institution is a level 2 institution, and it took a long time to get there. But in fact, I'm convinced that community colleges can be to level 2 institutions. When I moved from where I was now on an interim basis to Prestonsburg, the dynamics were totally different. And we can't take what we learned in its entirety in Elizabethtown and move it to Prestonsburg and make it work. You've got to discover in your grassroots effort as to how it will work in that environment.
It is deeply unique and almost biological to your system.
It's worse than the funding doesn't allow us to do that. We're the state with 37 performance indicators. Let's count everything, and some things, as you do better, you do worse on others, and that's how you're looked at.
Not only if you are tracking those indicators, but if those are not the indicators that you actually use to manage your business, you shouldn't be counting those. And so that means you take internal resources to manage your funder. That's what you're really doing. Right. And in fact, what happens in third-party pay organizations when you end up managing your funder is that that's the customer that you respond to quickest.
Of course.
All right? The system responds quickest to its customer. And meanwhile, is your system responding as quickly to business customers as you are to the legislature or to Ford if they ask for something, or if NBC? You know, right. The only solution, which is almost impossible, the only solution, and there was one really interesting example here with, was it one of the companies that actually, it was the Pennies, no, it was the Sears building. Who gave you the money for that? I'll let you speak now. What was that?
Okay, the money came from the state, from the Commonwealth.
State went through the company.
Yeah, typically they go right to the company and they give the equipment and training. But this time, because of the relationship and the trust that we had with Goodyear, they saw several win-wins, and so they said, the community college can do this faster if we can give it to the foundation.
He aligned the feedback loops and caused the customer to actually get the money. And you know, anyway, that's just a side note. But go ahead. Everyone's different. There's another great book by Jane Jacobs called The Nature of Economies, and she makes a big jump. She says that economic systems are natural systems. They're not like natural systems. They, in fact, are natural systems. They are governed by natural laws, ecological and biological laws. And what you're saying is your biosystem, your little region has its own uniqueness, its own endangered species, its own characteristics, and even though you are similar when you look at it, you're completely different over there. Okay, let's keep going down this road. Roy?
A couple of things.
Okay.
It seems that you've laid out in I don't know, they call it abstract, maybe a little exaggeration in some sense, but a conceptual framework that in one sense helps, fits all places. The specifics have to be adapted. For example, in our region, which is dominated by the extractive industries, we would have more in common with the UP and maybe even some of the issues relating to some of the reservations in terms of that domination by that kind of industry and the legacy that we've had to deal with that. So that, you know, is one factor we have to look at. In developing this, whether we choose to have these big community meetings or do it through initiatives, what you're looking for initially is it's similar to coalition building. In coalition building, you do that initially, that's more on a common interest basis.
Right.
And hopefully you widen the net and bring some people who may have some interest in that, maybe not fully committed.
Right.
Not all of those who are participants in that initial coalition are either at phase 1, phase 2, or 3. There may be parts of it. And as you're building that, sometimes, for example, you may encounter an institution that goes from phase 2 to phase 1.
Right.
And you have to kind of be flexible enough to deal with
remediation.
Yeah,
you take some kind of action, and it has some impact in their world. And others sort of see that impact. And Roy says it builds, people reflect on the experience, and others join the next action. They sort of sat out the last time, but now they're coming in, which affects stakeholders, and it's this cycle that you just described.